Thus, it happened that the workers who were at the construction site of the stellar pipes pushed back Mothra the giant. And in his fury and agony, Mothra uttered one final shot from his laser antennae that set half the weed of humanity on fire. And with his last breath, he inhaled the fiery steam and exploded in a vast cloud of stardust. After 10 years, the impervious dust had settled, and terror came over the humans as they saw what Mothra had left behind. A gigantic green egg, indestructible, as heavy as a small moon. Whatever was in there would be the doom of the planet, with the DNA of a giant moth and weed. Thus they called it Weeðra. One generation passed, and Weeðra's egg, hardened and covered with moss, little trees, and birds' nests, became a tourist attraction rather than an imminent threat. That ended abruptly as the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of Mothra's defeat were about to take place at that very spot. People were drinking, feasting, and laughing when a sudden thunder made everyone listen up. The hull had a big crack reaching down from its tip. With a dull rumble, all sediments bursted away, and the egg stood there as green and shiny as on the day it appeared. People shook with terror. Deep, slow earthquakes followed and made the surrounding soil breathe. More cracks at the top of Weeðra's egg made the tip disappear, and the air immediately turned into an unpleasant warm mist that made breathing nearly impossible. The mist turned to thunderclouds within a few minutes, and with an enormous lightning and thunder and a scream that made the clouds vanish and the people run, Weeðra's larva was shot into space. People were confused and fell down from that enormous blast. Relief came over them when they realized Weeðra was gone and far out of sight and mind. Then the hollow earth began to drone. The increased humming from underground got louder and louder. People were confused. With Weeðra gone, they believed the world was safe again. Most of them were running to their cars and buses. But a few tried to get a glimpse over the edge into the abyss that Weeðra had left in the ground. They wanted to see what that noise was. Bats? Machines? Flies? And as the source of the sound finally arrived, people had to cover their ears and screamed in fear of those wing-bearers. A huge shadow emerged from the hole and immersed the land in darkness. A shadow swarm of millions and millions of moths in all sizes, but none of them smaller than a man, and some of them not unlike the shape of a man. Thus, the winged apocalypse began. Like a giant fist, The dark moth cloud came down onto Earth with a rumble. People were tossed through the air, torn apart, and eaten alive to their bones. Vehicles and buildings were demolished, and windows bursted into shards. The moths had no fear, the swarm had no direction, and nothing was in its way for long. The Earth's governments were uncertain about the nature of the attack and waited with their response. When the UN announced that the threat was no country, the armies of the world were united to keep the swarm from spreading all over the globe. The casualties got worse, and the human leaders joined in the call to heavier arms. Not much time passed, and the first nuclear bombs hit the mostly evacuated cities. And as the heads of the world and other survivors crawled into their bunkers and waited for the whole thing to blow over, scientists gathered in a secret facility to create a new weapon. Earth's struggle with the winged plague still heated up under the green yet vanishing light trail that illuminated the night sky and confirmed Weeðra's fateful departure. And as Weeðra's larva was flying past the Earth's moon with its glowing green tail, small parts were avulsed from its skin. While passing the other planets and moons, these small green capsules hit the surface of each celestial body. These egg-like capsules then just lay there, humming and fuming wherever they landed, in the sand, ice, and water. Thus, Weeðra, though still in comatose state, left the solar system and plunged into the vast black ocean of space and beyond the reach of man. Its impact in foreign terrain ended the journey abruptly. The soil was soft, so the immense speed forced Weeðra's larva deep into the ground. Weeðra's travel hull bursted away, and a huge hungry caterpillar appeared, and immediately started to eat its way towards the core of its new home. The swarms of moths on Earth seemed to be bound to Weeðra's will, and acted intelligently to avoid severe casualties. Yet their hunger for limbs, steel, and electricity was unbroken. And whenever a bomb detonated and moths died, another swarm came rushing in to feast on the energy. And as the armies of the planet lost battle after battle, scientists tried a different approach. At the Leaders' Summit, they told those gathered round the table that if there were any connections between Weeðra and its winged servants, the ultimate goal would be to track down, hunt, and kill Weeðra wherever its new destination. The commanders-in-chief laughed. "No man can harm that monster. This is impossible," they taunted. But an unbearable scratching noise interrupted the laughter and brought everyone to silence. Claws slowly ridging the marble wall. "Not anymore," it hissed loudly and untraceably. And from the dark corners, they emerged into the middle of the assembly. Ambassadors of a new dawn, a new type. The Axolotl Astronauts. The Astrolotls, as the scientists called them, were a neotenic type, designed from human and cave salamander DNA. A few thousand humanoid axolotls, numbered and heavily armed, were all they could afford to create in such a short period of time. And when the first spaceships took off to find Weeðra, mankind took a deep breath of that glimpse of hope. Moths kept attacking the rockets and ships, and a handful of Astrolotls had to stay on the Earth due to their demolished spacecrafts. But with enough firepower, they cleared the path for the others to ascend to fulfill their task hunting down Weeðra. As they left their home planet behind them, they were still able to trace subtle remains of the green particle dust trails and followed them. But these trails seemed to have split up into more tiny parts that led to other locations. Approaching Mars, they eventually saw it. The green landing capsule that bursted away from Weeðra's cocoon had been destroyed, and again, countless moths hatched from the vessel and started to spread over the red ground. Thus, the mission got an upgrade, clearing the solar system from the winged space moth plague. Mars was a welcoming warm-up, but the real show waited for the Astrolotls after they passed the asteroid belt and reached Jupiter. The giant gas planet and its moons were so infested with moths, it took many of the astronauts' limbs and lives to overcome. Fortunately, and this was the best thing about the new breed, the Astrolotls' limbs would regrow within days. Decimated, they reached the outer rim of the solar system, where the trace of Weeðra, or the Moth God, as some Earthlings would call him now, was nearly gone. And when they feared they lost the path, the astronauts found a huge cylindrical asteroid with an enormous hole in it that didn't look quite coincidental. So they prepared for the worst and charged. But when they entered the lair, Weeðra was gone. Of course, Weeðra, through its connection to the moths, already knew about their coming and attacked the surprised Astrolotls with a devastating taunt. Though they knew Mothra and the egg from video footage and other confidential sources, the astronauts were overwhelmed by the sheer size of Weeðra's final form. A godlike green moth with glowing eyes and wings that looked partially like giant weed leaves and gloomed everything beneath them in pure darkness. The fight got worse every second, and Astrolotls died like flies. Weeðra's laser palps vaporized the bodies, and its wings hurled their dust away into the cold realms of space. Among the last astronauts, there was one cunning axolotl soldier numbered Ax-420. When he got hit by Weeðra's wing and smashed against the asteroid, ripping his suit, he quickly got into the suit of his recently vaporized companion. With a scrap of cloth, he tied his last grenade to the liquid oxygen device of his old suit, aimed and chipped off the valve. With a fierce thrust, it hit Weeðra's head and burst into imploding flames, scorching the antennae of the giant green monster. Weeðra, dazed and confused, cried in agony. The explosion exceeded the expected outcome, and its thrust scattered the rest of the company and their ships. Thus, Weeðra, dethroned, disillusioned, and unconscious, drifted away into the cold, black depths of outer space. While the amphibian space army was out hunting Weeðra, the ways of dealing with the winged apocalypse on Earth got twisted. Most people hid underground in cellars, mines, tunnels, sewers, and caves, and tried to establish a new lifestyle far from generating visible light that attracted the man-eating moth menace. Others were forced to fight and clean the areas around their home as well as possible to maintain life as they remembered it from the green era before the plague. But there was a third way. First, around the remains of Mothra's broken egg, a few people in dark green hoods with bongs gathered to worship a new god, becoming more global after the hatching, benefiting and growing with people's fear of this new world order and the permanent threat of losing everything to the moths. Anxious to serve the new situation, they killed the moths they said they worshipped and contained their secretion in tanks to sell it as an ointment, and sold pieces of the egg as relics. Before they got richer, people would sneer at this church of the flying weed god. But as Earth was tumbling towards doomsday, and this new cult promised to spare all believers from the sickness that had befallen their home planet, the interest in getting saved from the persistent threat rose to a new high. In fact, their ointment had side effects. The carrier was invisible to moths for a moment. Also, it drove him mad over time, and addicted to this bad trip. In the moment of Weeðra's defeat, the war on Earth took a dramatic turn. The moth swarms, once connected and devoted to their stellar overlord, were released from their invisible bond. Though the moths were free now, a great number continued devastating what was not yet wide wastelands on Earth. Others hid in fear or attacked their own kind. And while the Church of the Flying Weed God gained strength and taught people about the Weeðra's second coming, a group of biologists turned against them and teamed up to establish a global elite unit of volunteers and war veterans. They also feared Weeðra would come back, since the contact to the Astrolotls was interrupted and believed to be lost. They used flares and light balloons to lure hundreds of moths into cages. The teams managed to tame the flying savages with pheromones and used the bigger moths as mounts, equipped with heavy machinery and weapons. The veterans were trained to form a flying cavalry. This was the birth of the Mothriders, the rogue army of survivors sworn to fight the corruption of Weeðra's cult and destroy the rest of the flying plague, to finally be able to restore a rational future for humanity.